reading from the Gospel according to St. Luke in the 23rd chapter. 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they had come to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified him, one on his right and one on his left. And then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
They are among the most astonishing and challenging words Jesus ever spoke. Astonishing because of the moment in which he uttered them, challenging because they fly in the face of what so many of us consider reasonable, even possible. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They, of course, refers to the crowds, the religious leaders, the Romans, all who were guilty together of the greatest crime in human history, attempted deicide, trying to kill off the Son of God. It's truly astonishing that Jesus could utter words of forgiveness even toward the soldiers who at that moment were nailing him to the cross. He was extending forgiveness to people who had no compunction about what they were doing. Indeed, he says they don't even realize what they are actually about. Now, these words might at first sound a little like an excuse, in some way mitigating their guilt. They don't know what they're doing. But I don't think that's the case. After all, he calls upon his Father to forgive, which implies they are responsible. There can indeed be a guilty ignorance, especially if it derives from ignoring God. Most people, I think, don't set out deliberately to do evil. The problem is that we proceed with our lives, our plans, our goals, ignoring God's call, God's will, God's commandments. We proceed as if God's ways are irrelevant, and that is when we wind up not knowing what we do. I recall an incident when my children were young, and the youngest, only 3 or 4 at the time, was being goaded by one of his sisters at the dinner table. And in anger, he picked up the salt shaker and threw it at her. It hit her in the head and caused a minor cut. But head wounds, even minor ones, tend to produce a lot of blood. And it was a mess, and there was lots of wailing. Well, the little one was distraught, and he kept saying, "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." And I shot back, "Oh, yes, you did. You just didn't intend it to have as bad a result as it did, but you meant what you did." He knew not what he was doing. Isn't it often the case that we don't realize the actual impact or trajectory of our actions? Even when trying to be helpful sometimes, there can be unintended consequences. Perhaps you read the book a few years ago called Toxic Charity, subtitled "How Churches and Charities Hurt Those They Help." It argued that often our well-intentioned charity work can actually deepen rather than free people from cycles of dependency and poverty. Unintended consequences. We know not what we do. And the more we go about our actions, whether trying to help others or just doing our own thing, but we do so in ignorance of God's truth, of God's ways, and of God's commands, the more those unintended consequences stack up. And the more we need forgiveness. Jesus here, I think, is setting a standard and calling us to practice the most radical kind of forgiveness, even offering it to folks who don't know they need it. It may seem impossible, but what is the alternative to practicing forgiveness? Practicing unforgiveness? In his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, author Philip Yancey coined the term ungrace and invited us to imagine a world in which there is only and always ungrace. That is, where forgiveness is never offered or accepted, where grudges are always nursed, where everyone is always seeking to even the score, exact their pound of flesh, and see to it that every infraction, every violation is punished. Well, it seems to me we may not have to wait much longer to imagine that. As we move more and more into what some have called cancel culture, where it seems that ungrace, practicing unforgiveness, is becoming more popular. We look for misdeeds of the past, indiscreet or bigoted comments that may have been uttered years ago, and even if the perpetrator has changed or expressed remorse, it does not matter. They must be canceled, fired, publicly condemned. We are even digging up the dead and posthumously condemning people from the past, everyone from George Washington to Dr. Seuss. Now, I'm in no way excusing the blind spots, the sins, even the outright evils that may indeed be part of the record of such people. But who among us is without such sins of our own? I am so glad I grew up in a time when not every idle, stupid, lustful, bigoted word I ever uttered in my teens or 20s was forever preserved on the internet. And I worry about young people today who may be practicing the ungrace of cancel culture. In 20 or 25 years, things they say or do today, which are out of step with the values of that time, may be used to destroy them. Beware the guillotine you erect for others. You may one day find its blade poised above your own neck. What we need to cultivate is not a cancel culture, but a forgiveness culture. One last thought. I confess that what often motivates me to practice grace and forgiveness is the knowledge that I also need to be forgiven on a regular basis. And here is what sets apart those words of Jesus when he said, "Father, forgive them. For they were spoken by the only person who ever lived who was without sin, who needed no forgiveness. The God whom Jesus reveals, in whom there is no darkness at all, extends mercy to people like us, in whom there is often much darkness." And that puts the Lord's forgiveness into a category all its own. Maybe that's why Shakespeare so famously said, "To err is human, to forgive divine." But here's the good news. The divine life of God courses through the frail frames of redeemed sinners like you and me. And there is grace abundant poured out upon us, so that we may also extend grace and practice forgiveness, as our Lord did and still does. Father, forgive us for all which we do that we know not, and help us also to forgive, even as we have been forgiven.
In the mystery of life we meet you. In the mysteries of life we meet you, in the intensity of the silence, in the sudden realization of the power of love. In the beauty we stumble upon you, which makes us stop and catch our breath and wonder. And in the relationships that are ours, where you are presented, what tenderness is shared, which helps us sense something of meaning and being. So there you are, and here we are. catching glimpses of you and being startled in the glory of precious scarred moments. Faithful God of love, saving God who renews us. We confess our regrets. We share with you our most optimistic dreams, and we bring to you all our hurts and all of our brushings. And with this we do confidently because you understand. You understand us better than we understand ourselves. For running away from your love, you forgive us. For preferring the safe and familiar, you forgive us. In refusing to believe in the power, you forgive us. For not being prepared to transform ourselves and reach the potential for which we are made, you forgive us. And because from this moment we are new people, born again, and given yet another chance to live. So with heaven and earth and all creation we praise and bless your holy name.